Take one.
Who are you covering the war in Vietnam for, Jim?
I worked for the ABC Radio News and Television News and Radio Australia.
That's quite a lot of people to cover for.
Yes, this was one of the problems we had in Vietnam, was that it was always a one-man show and you had so many programs to work to, both Radio Australia and the home service. And at home there was the radio news, radio current affairs and television.
Did you feel that you could give it adequate attention to each individual specialised field?
No, we couldn't.
Did you have a cameraman working with you full time?
No. During my term there we had to utilise the Viz News cameraman and his assistants.
One of those Viz News cameramen was Neil Davis, wasn't he?
Yes.
What was Neil like? What do you know about him?
Neil was one of the great correspondents of the Vietnam War, without any doubt whatsoever. He was a very brave and very competent cameraman, and he was also a very talented journalist as well. His understanding of the Vietnamese scene in its entirety was quite remarkable. He was much more than just a technician with a camera.
Did you go out into the field often with him?
Not very often. Neil preferred to work alone by and large, and he would go to places where very few other correspondents would go. For example, with the Vietnamese troops. He had tremendous rapport with many units in the Vietnamese army and would go into situations with them that most other correspondents would steer shy of.
Do you think that he had a certain feeling of invincibility about him to do this?
Yes, I think he felt that he had an extraordinary amount of luck on his side. He would get frightened, but he'd always go back for more.
How did he show his fright?
Oh, he'd joke about it mainly. He was always laughing and joking about his experiences, but at the same time you knew that behind the smiling facade was a man who'd seen a lot that he might have preferred to have avoided, but would go back for more.
What was your own attitude towards covering the war?
Well, it was another reporting job that demanded all the skills that one could put into action. It was a hard task, mainly because we were so short of support equipment and support staff. We had to improvise so often that it made life very, very difficult to do a thoroughly professional job. But it was a very challenging one professionally.
Do you think that the ABC let you down as being one of their representatives and let down the public in Australia because they didn't really have the backup facilities that you needed to do your job?
Yes, I suppose that's a fair enough statement. We didn't have a staff cameraman and sound technician, so therefore we were without some of the essential resources that other networks had, the American networks for example. And as a consequence of that, I feel that we weren't able to deliver a thoroughly professional and competent product back to the home service.
What was the ABC's management's attitude towards covering the war?
I don't know. They never gave me any official instructions. It was left entirely to my own initiative, and I think that was the case with most of the correspondents who went up there. We never got criticised for what we did, to my knowledge. On the other hand, there was seldom any praise either. It was just, it seemed as if it was just another job that had to be done.
Do you think the ABC fully lived up to its responsibility in covering the war in terms of allowing you to give an interpretive piece on the way you thought the war was going?
No, I don't think so, because in those days there was a fairly rigid division between the responsibility of the news reporter and the responsibility of what was then called the talks department. And news concentrated very largely on the event and not so much as to what it meant in the overall scheme of things. And one tended to report events rather than their meaning in the overall context of things. This was the style of the time. Most of us who worked up there realised very quickly that this was not an adequate way to responsibly cover the conflict.
Okay.
Unreal.
Okay, Margaret.
2.
Did you get a chance to give any interpretation on how you thought the war was going?
Not really. In some of the talks pieces that were done for some programs on the home radio and on Radio Australia, there was a limited opportunity to put across an interpretation of how some aspects of the war were going. But in television, which had its biggest impact, we had very, very little opportunity to do an in-depth interpretive report. Most of our reporting was devoted to events, localised engagements, localised happenings, particularly those concerning the Australian Task Force. There was not much opportunity, and we found this very frustrating, to come to grips with the war as a whole and try to convey some impression to a television audience how it was going and where it was going. In those days there was a very rigid division in the ABC between news and talks, and the newsman working towards the home news coverage was encouraged, and it was policy to concentrate on the event and not so much on what it meant.
Since you're the only man in the field covering both news and talks, or as we know, current affairs now, do you think that public opinion would have been changed more quickly in Australia if men like yourself had been given more chance to interpret what you saw the events firsthand?
Yes, well, there is a danger, of course, that one would misinterpret the events, but on the other hand, there was always the opportunity that one would give a correct interpretation. And I think this is where the American networks excelled, in that their men in the field with a lot of experience were able to give accurate interpretations of what was happening. Yes, I believe that we would have been able to have had a bigger impact on Australian public opinion. Australian public opinion would have been better informed and more able to come to sensible conclusions about the war had we been able to do more interpretive reporting for television. I believe that the Australian public opinion was more influenced by replays of American reports on television than they were by what we were able to produce for our own system.
Did you ever get the feeling that the ABC management, those back in Australia, were totally divorced from the problems you faced in the field, covering the war, the problems that you had?
I think many of the middle-level executives were, and possibly some of the top-level executives were quite unaware of just how difficult it could be to cover a war like this, and I think probably quite unaware of the frustrations that we were suffering from not having adequate staff to assist us.
Did you ever get any feedback at all as to how your reports were being received in Australia or what they were using?
Not really, no. There wasn't a very well organised system of feedback in those days. Most of the feedback that I got was from my parents, who monitored as much radio and television as they could.
Do you think that in the future, any major war that Australia is involved in, that the ABC will cover it in a different fashion?
One would hope so. I think we learned a lot from that war in terms of news coverage. I think that there is a professional realisation that we would have to deploy far more resources in the field in the future, and I think that this is apparent to everybody, both in the journalistic side and in the management level.
How do newsmen go about combating fear when they're in a war zone?
Or you cope with it at the time.
Do you think that you'd go back into a war zone now on post-experience?
We could all go back. Whether we'd enjoy it very much is debatable. I wouldn't like to go back to another war.
Simply because?
Wars are futile. Wars are crazy.
Do you feel a responsibility that someone's got to cover them, don't they? Obviously, it's what people seem to be interested in. It's what man seems to get himself involved in.
Yes. Well, there are some journalists and reporters who thrive on trouble and thrive on wars. Neil Davis is a case in point. He thrives when the going's tough and when there's conflict all around him. I discovered that I don't really thrive in that sort of environment.
All right, good.